The auction hall on Nexus Prime stretched wider than any building Kan-Jisiot had ever seen on Earth. And the sight of it made his chest tight with a feeling he refused to call fear. He sat among 47 other humans in a holding area marked by glowing blue barriers. And he watched the aliens walk past them like shoppers examining fruit at a market 6 months ago. He had been a paramedic in Bizen, responding to emergencies and saving lives with steady hands and a calm heart. But now he was merchandise on a space station, orbiting a star whose name he could not pronounce. The elderly man beside him, a retired teacher named Park Wonchik, coughed weakly and clutched his side where a guard had struck him 3 days before. "Let me check your ribs again," Jisiok said quietly. And the old man nodded with tired gratitude. Jacek pressed gentle fingers against the bruised area and felt the familiar landscape of damaged tissue beneath skin. And he knew at least 2 ribs were cracked but not broken. "You need to breathe slowly," he told Wonchik, "and try not to move suddenly when they inspect us around them." Other humans reacted to their captivity in different ways, and Jisiok understood every response without judgment. Some wept openly, while others shouted curses at passing aliens, and a few sat frozen in shock with empty eyes that saw nothing. Jisiok had moved past all of those stages in his first week of captivity, and now he simply watched and waited and helped where he could. A commotion near the main entrance drew his attention, and he saw the crowd of alien traders and buyers part like water before a ship. The being who walked through that gap was unlike anything Jisiok had encountered in his months among the stars. She stood nearly 7 feet tall, with skin like polished obsidian that reflected the station lights in purple and blue shimmer. And her features combined something insectoid with something almost elfin in a way that should have been terrifying, but somehow was not. 4 arms emerged from her torso, each one ending in delicate fingers that moved with hypnotic grace. And her eyes, large and multifaceted like a dragonfly, scanned the hall with obvious intelligence. "That is Queen Velith, Sorena of the Volathri Dominion," whispered a human woman who had been captured from a diplomatic vessel and knew such things. The name meant nothing to Jisiok, but the reactions of every alien in the hall told him everything he needed to know about this being's importance. Traders bowed so low their faces nearly touched the floor, and armed guards snapped to attention with military precision that crossed all species boundaries. The Queen moved through the hall with her small entourage of advisors trailing behind her like ducklings following their mother, and her multifaceted eyes passed over each display of goods and beings with what seemed like bored disinterest until satirist. She reached the human holding. Jisiok felt something strange then, a pressure against his mind like fingers pressing on the outside of a window, and he instinctively pushed back against it without knowing how. The Queen's head tilted sharply, and those compound eyes focused on him with sudden intensity that made several humans around him shrink back in terror. But Jisiok simply met her gaze and waited. He had learned long ago that fear was useful only when it motivated action, and in this moment there was no action available to him, so fear would serve no purpose. The Queen spoke to one of her advisors in a language that sounded like wind chimes mixed with clicking stones, and the advisor, a smaller Velethri with more muted coloring, responded with obvious surprise. More conversation followed, and Jisiok noticed the advisor growing agitated while the Queen remained perfectly still. Finally, the Queen raised one of her 4 hands in a gesture that clearly meant silence, and the advisor stopped speaking immediately. She walked closer to the barrier and looked down at Jisiok with an expression he could not read on her alien features. "You," she said, and her voice carried a strange harmonic quality, as if 3 people spoke the same word at slightly different times. "Why do you not fear me when all others do?" Jisiok considered the question carefully before answering, and he noticed that one chick beside him was trembling badly. "Fear does not help anyone," he said simply. "So I see no reason to feel it right now, and I wonder what you need from me." "Your Majesty." The Queen's compound eyes flickered with colors that shifted too fast for Jiseok to track, and he guessed this might be her species' equivalent of surprise. "You know what I am," she observed. "Everyone here knows what you are," Jiseok replied. "And your presence commands respect from beings I have seen show respect to nothing. So you must be very important indeed." One of the Queen's advisors made a sharp sound of disapproval at Jiseok's casual tone, but the Queen herself remained silent for a long moment. "I came here seeking a human for my court," she finally said, "because I have heard your species possesses certain unusual qualities, and I wish to observe these qualities for myself." "And what qualities are those?" Jiseok asked. "Resilience," the Queen answered, "and something my translators call stubbornness, though I suspect the true meaning is more complex." Jiseok almost smiled at that, but he held the expression back because smiling at royalty might be considered rude in our culture. "Then you have come to the right species," he said, "though I cannot speak for any human but myself." The Queen turned to the auction master, a blob-like creature that floated on a cushion of directed gravity, and she spoke words that Jiseok could not understand, but he understood the meaning well enough when guards came to lower the barrier and pull him from the group. "Wait, Jiseok said, and he gestured toward Wanshik. "This man is injured and needs medical care. And if you are taking me to serve you, then I ask that you also take him and ensure he receives treatment." The advisor who had argued earlier made another sharp sound, and this time Jiseok caught words in broken translation. "Demands nothing position make requests." But the Queen raised her hand again, and silence fell as she studied Jiseok with those impossible eyes, and he felt that pressure against his mind once more. "Probing and curious. You bargain for another when you have no power," she observed. "And this interests me greatly." She spoke again to the auction master, and moments later, Wanchik was being carried out on a medical stretcher by beings who handled him with surprising gentleness. "Come," the Queen said to Jiseok, "and let us see what other interesting things you might do." As Jiseok followed her from the auction hall, he did not know that he walked toward a destiny that would shake the foundations of an empire. And he did not know that the Queen who had chosen him on impulse would one day stare at him in wonder. He only knew that he had saved one life today, and that was enough for now. The Velathri homeworld was called Velathos, and when Jiseok first saw it through the transport ship's viewing window, he understood why the species who lived there considered themselves superior to most others. Crystal spires rose from the planet's surface, like frozen lightning reaching toward the sky, and gardens floated between them on platforms of technology so advanced it seemed like magic to his human eyes. The royal palace stood at the center of the capital city, a structure of interlocking geometric shapes that glowed with soft inner light and hummed with energy he could feel in his. Bonjizik had been assigned quarters in the servants' wing, a small room with a sleeping platform and a window that looked out over the floating gardens. And he had been given simple duties that mostly involved cleaning and carrying things. 3 weeks passed in this way, and during that time, Jiseok learned more than anyone expected him till he listened to conversations that servants were supposed to ignore, and he watched the patterns of palace life with the same careful attention he had once used to assess emergency patients. The Velathri language came to him slowly at first and then faster as his brain adapted to its strange sounds and structures. And soon he could understand most of what was said around him, even if he could not speak it well. The other servants, beings from a dozen different species, treated him with either contempt or pity, and he accepted both without complaint. "Humans are primitive," a four-armed Gethric servant told him one morning while they worked together in the great hall. And everyone knows your species only recently discovered space travel. So you should feel honored to serve the Velathri at all. HFY nodded politely and continued his work. And he did not bother to explain that honor meant little to someone who had been stolen from his home and sold like property. But not everyone in the palace looked down on him, Princess. Mirith was the queen's younger sister, a Velathri female whose colors were softer golds and greens compared to her sister's dramatic purple-black. And she possessed a curiosity about the universe that her people's rigid social structure could not contain. She found HFY one day in the garden levels, where he had been sent to collect fallen crystal flowers for the evening ceremony. "You are the human my sister purchased," she said, and her voice carried the same harmonic quality as the queen's, but with a lighter, more musical tone. "I am," HFY confirmed. And he bowed in the manner he had observed other servants using. "You do not need to bow to me when no one is watching," Mirith said with what HFY had learned to recognize as a Velathri smile, a subtle shift in the colors around her eyes. "And I am more interested in talking than in being worshipped." Over the following weeks, Mirith sought him out often, and she asked him endless questions about Earth and humans and the strange customs of his species. HFY answered honestly. And in return, he learned about Velathri society from someone willing to explain it without judgment. "My sister is a good queen," Mirith told him one afternoon as they walked through a crystal grove. "But she faces many challenges from those who think she is too young to rule." "Challenges from whom?" HFY asked, and Mirith's colors shifted to darker shades that he now knew indicated discomfort. "There are those in court who believe the old ways were better," she said carefully, "and High Advisor Catherine leads those who whisper against her." HFY filed that name away in his memory and began watching the advisor whenever their paths crossed in the palace. Ekathron was older than most Velathri HFY had seen. His colors faded to pale grays and silvers, and he moved through the palace with the confidence of someone who believed he deserved more than he had been given. 1 month after HFY's arrival, Princess Mirith felt she had been walking on one of the higher garden platforms when the ancient structure shifted beneath her feet, and she tumbled down a rocky slope before anyone could reach her. HFY heard the commotion from 3 levels away, and his body moved before his mind finished processing the sound. He ran through corridors and up crystal stairs, pushing past confused servants and startled guards. And when he reached the garden platform, he found Mirith lying unconscious with purple blood seeping from a wound on her head. Several Velathri stood around her in apparent shock, their species' instinct for careful deliberation working against them in this moment of crisis. HFY dropped to his knees beside the princess and let his training take control. "I need clean cloth and water," he ordered in broken Velathri. And when no one moved, he repeated the command in a sharper tone that made several aliens flinch. Someone finally brought what he needed, and HFY worked quickly to assess the princess's injuries. The head wound was shallow, the bleeding heavily as head wounds always did, and her right arm was bent at an angle that told him it was broken. More concerning was her breathing, which came in short gasps that suggested possible damage to her chest. HFY stabilized her neck with his hands and directed others to support her body, and he kept her airways clear while sending someone to summon the royal physicians. By the time the medical team arrived with their floating stretchers and humming devices, Mirith's breathing had steadied and the bleeding had slowed. The lead physician, a tall Velathri with instruments HFY did not recognize, scanned the princess and then turned to look at HFY with obvious surprise. "You prevented secondary injury to her spine," the physician said, "and if she had been moved incorrectly, she might never have walked again." HFY simply nodded and stepped back as they took Mirith away. He did not notice Queen Valith watching from a balcony above, and he did not see the way her multifaceted eyes followed him as he returned to his duties with blood still on his hands. But He did notice High Advisor Keth Ron standing in the shadows nearby, and he did notice the calculating expression on the old Velathri's face as he looked between Giziok and the balcony where the Queen had stood that night. Giziok lay awake on his sleeping platform and thought about what he had observed. The advisor had not looked concerned about the princess's fall, and his attention had focused on the Queen's interest in the human servant rather than on the injured royal. Something was wrong in this palace. And Giziok's instincts, the same instincts that had saved countless lives during his years as a paramedic, told him that danger was growing in the shadows. He did not know yet what form that danger would take, but he knew he would not ignore it 3 days later. While collecting dishes from a private meeting room, Giziok heard voices from behind a partly closed door. "The Concord Summit will be the perfect opportunity," someone said in Velathri, and Giziok recognized the faded tones of Keth Run's voice. "And when the Queen falls, no one will suspect anything but an accident." Giziok's blood turned to ice in his veins, and he stood frozen in the corridor with dirty plates in his hands. While treason whispered through the door, he had discovered a plot to murder the Queen, and he was nothing but a human slave with no power and no voice. But he had made a choice long ago to help those who needed him. And that choice did not change just because the stakes had grown higher than he ever imagined. Giziok spent 3 sleepless nights trying to decide what to do with the terrible knowledge he carried. He walked through the palace corridors and performed his duties and smiled when expected to smile. But behind his calm expression, his mind raced through possibility after possibility. Who could he tell about the conspiracy against Queen Valith? He tried the guards first, approaching a patrol commander with what he believed was important information about Palace security. The commander, a massive Velathri warrior with scars crossing his chest. Plates looked down at Giziok with the kind of contempt usually reserved for insects found in food. "A human servant claims to have overheard treason from the High Advisor," the commander repeated slowly, and his colors shifted to shades of mocking amusement. "And you expect me to believe this fantasy without evidence or standing or even proper language skills?" "I know what I heard," Giziok insisted, but the commander had already turned away. "Return to your duties before I report you for wasting security resources," the warrior said over his shoulder. "And consider yourself fortunate that I do not have you punished for slandering a respected member of the court." Other attempts went no better. A minor noble laughed in his face, and a senior servant warned him that continuing to spread such stories would result in his execution for sedition. The hierarchy of Velathri society closed around him like walls of glass, transparent enough that he could see what needed to be done, but impossible to break through. On the 4th night, Mirith found him sitting alone in the crystal garden where they often talked, and her colors shifted to concerned blues when she saw his face. "You look terrible," she said simply, sitting beside him on the bench, "and you have not been yourself since my accident." Giziok hesitated, and the weight of his secret pressed against his chest like a stone. Telling Mirith would put her in danger, but keeping silent might lead to her sister's death. "If I tell you something," he said slowly, "you must promise to listen completely before responding. And you must understand that I would never lie about something this serious." Mirith's colors darkened with worry, but she nodded, and Giziok told her everything. He described the conversation he had overheard, the voices he had recognized, and the reference to the Concord Summit as the opportunity for the Queen's assassination. When he finished, Mirith sat in silence for a long moment, and her colors cycled through patterns he had never seen before. "You are either very brave or very foolish to tell me this," she finally said, "and I believe you are both. Can you warn your sister?" Giziok asked, and hope flickered in his chest for the first time in days. But Mirith's colors shifted to frustrated orange, and she shook her head slowly. Kethron controls the intelligence networks and has allies throughout the court, she explained. And any formal accusation without solid proof would be dismissed as the fantasy of a young princess, while you would be executed for spreading lies about a high advisor. Then what can we do? Jiziok demanded, and his voice carried more force than he intended. Mirith studied him with those compound eyes that seemed to see through every layer of his human pretense. And then she smiled in the Velithri way. We gather proof, she said, and we do it carefully and quietly, without alerting anyone to what we know. I am just a servant, Jiziok reminded her, and I have no access to secure areas or private communications. But you can move through the palace without drawing attention, Mirith countered. And no one pays attention to a human carrying dirty dishes or cleaning floors. She was right. Jiziok realized, and his mind began working through the possibilities over the following 2 weeks. He transformed his duties into opportunities for observation, volunteered for tasks that took him near Kethron's private chambers, and he memorized the guard schedules and servant rotations throughout the palace. He noticed which advisors met with Kethron after official business hours, and he tracked the patterns of coded messages that passed between certain members of the court. Mirith provided him with a small recording device disguised as a cleaning tool, and Jiziok captured fragments of conversations. That painted an increasingly clear picture of the conspiracy. The plot involved not just Kethron, but a network of nobles who believed the old matriarchal traditions had weakened under Velas reforms, and their plan called for the Queen's death to appear as an attack by enemies of the Dominion rather than internal treachery. A replacement ruler had already been selected, a distant cousin who would restore the proper order of things under Kethron's guidance. Concord Summit was less than 1 week away when Queen Valith summoned Jiziok to her private audience chamber. He had never been alone with her since the day of his purchase, and he entered the room with his heart pounding so loudly he was certain she could hear it. The Queen sat on a raised platform surrounded by floating screens that displayed information he could not read, and her multifaceted eyes watched him approach with an intensity that made his skin prickle. Something is happening in my palace, she said without greeting or preamble, and my senses tell me you know more than a servant should about matters beyond your station. Jiziok faced a choice in that moment. He could deny everything and protect himself, or he could trust a being he barely knew with information that could save her life or end his own. He thought of Wanchik, the old man he had bargained for at the auction, now recovered and working peacefully in the palace kitchens. He thought of Mirith, who had trusted him with her friendship, despite every rule of her society telling her not to. He thought of his training and his purpose and the oath he had taken as a paramedic to protect life above all else. Your Majesty, he said, and his voice came out steadier than he expected. What I am about to tell you may sound impossible, and I have no official standing to make accusations against anyone. He paused and met her impossible eyes with his merely human ones. But High Advisor Kethron is planning to have you killed during the Concord Summit, and I have spent the past 2 weeks gathering evidence that I believe will prove it. The Queen's colors shifted through a spectrum of emotions too fast for Jiziok to track, and she leaned forward on her platform with a grace that reminded him of a predator spotting prey. Tell me everything, she commanded, and do not leave out a single detail. Jiziok told her he shared every observation, every recorded conversation, every pattern he had noticed in the movements of the conspirators. When he finished, Queen Valith sat in silence for a very long time, and her colors settled into a deep purple that he could not interpret. You could have used this information to buy your freedom, she finally said, and instead you brought it to me even knowing that I might not believe you. I am not interested in buying freedom with the cost of your life. Jiseok replied simply. The queen rose from her platform and descended the steps until she stood directly in front of him. And for the first time, he realized how much taller she was, her presence filling the room in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. "Human," she said softly. "You continue to surprise me in ways I did not think possible." She reached out with one of her 4 hands and touched his shoulder in a gesture he instinctively understood as significant. "I cannot act against Kethron openly without causing the very chaos he desires," she continued. "But I can take steps to protect myself during the summit." Her colors shifted to something warmer, and she smiled in the Velathri way. "And I can ensure that you are close to me when the danger comes, because I suspect you are more valuable than anyone in this palace realizes." Jiseok bowed his head in acknowledgement. But inside his chest, his heart had begun to beat with a new rhythm. The game had changed, and he was no longer a piece on someone else's board. He had become a player in his own right, and the fate of an empire now rested partly on his merely human shoulders. The Concord Summit brought representatives from 12 galactic powers to Velathos, and the crystal spires of the capital city gleamed with decorations that had not been displayed in a century. Ships of every design filled the orbital stations above the planet, and the palace corridors overflowed with aliens whose shapes and sizes spanned the full range of what life could Beko Magisiak move through. This chaos wearing something he had never expected to wear, the ceremonial armor of a Queen Shadow. The title was ancient, dating back to wars fought before humans had discovered fire, and it had remained empty for 400 years because no Velathri ruler had felt the need for such close personal protection. Queen Velith's announcement that she was filling the role with a human servant had caused an uproar that echoed through every level of the court. Kithron himself had protested loudly, arguing that placing an inferior species in such a sacred position insulted the memory of every shadow who had served before. But Velith had simply smiled and reminded the court that the choice of shadow belonged solely to the monarch, and she had made her choice. The armor was uncomfortable, and the ceremonial blade at his hip was heavier than anything Jiseok had carried since his military service years ago. But he wore both with the same calm acceptance he had shown since arriving on Velathoshet. Mattered was not the costume, but the access it provided as Queen Shadow. He stood behind Velith during every public function, and he was permitted to enter rooms that no servant could approach. He watched the delegations arrive with careful attention, noting which ambassadors greeted Kethron with familiarity and which seemed surprised by the High Advisor's influence. Ambassador Torvin of the Dracarith Collective was among the most memorable arrivals, a reptilian warrior whose scales were the deep red of dried blood and whose eyes held the cold assessment of a predator evaluating potential prey. "So you are the human who has caused such controversy," Torvin said when their paths crossed during the opening reception, his voice a rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate in Jiseok's bones. "I am simply doing my duty," Jiseok replied, and Torvin's lipless mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile. "Your species has done much simply doing duty since you stumbled into the stars," the ambassador observed. "And some of us have begun to wonder if there is more to humanity than meets the eye." Jiseok stored that comment away for later consideration and returned his attention to his primary task, watching for threats against the Queen. The summit's opening ceremony took place in the Grand Crystalline Hall, a space so vast that Jiseok's eyes struggled to find its boundaries. 12 platforms floated at various heights around a central stage where Queen Velith would deliver the traditional welcome address, and each platform held a delegation with their guards and advisors and ceremonial displays. Jiseok stood 3 steps behind the Queen on the Velathri platform, and his eyes never stopped moving across the The ceremony began with chanting from Velethri priests whose voices resonated with the crystal structures until the entire hall hummed with harmonic frequencies that Giseok felt in his teeth. Queen Veleth rose and walked to the central speaking position. Her forearms spread wide in the traditional gesture of welcome and peace. Honored representatives of the 12 powers, she began, and her voice carried clearly through the hall without any apparent amplification. We gather in this ancient place to renew the bonds that hold our civilizations together. Giseok listened with half his attention, while the other half tracked movement throughout the chamber. A figure in servant's clothing was moving against the flow of other servants, and something about the way they walked triggered alarms in Giseok's trained mind. The figure was too focused, too purposeful, and their path led directly toward a position with a clear line of sight to where the queen stood. Giseok's body began moving before his conscious mind finished the analysis. He was too far from Veleth, 20 meters at least, and the figure was raising something that gleamed with the cold light of a weapon. Majesty, Giseok shouted, and he ran. The crowd seemed to move in slow motion around him as he pushed through beings twice his size, his merely human muscles burning with effort as he crossed the impossible distance. The assassin's weapon, a neural disruptor his mind supplied from somewhere, was leveling at Veleth's exposed back. She was turning at his shout, her colors shifting to confusion and alarm. But she would never turn fast enough. Giseok threw himself across the final meters and tackled the queen to the ground, his body covering hers as the disruptor fired. The beam hit him squarely in the back, and the world exploded into white fire. Every nerve in his body screamed at once as the neural disruption cascaded through his system, and he felt his muscles seize and his heart stutter and his vision dissolve into static. He should have died. Weapon was designed to overload any nervous system with a single pulse, and no species in the known galaxy could survive a direct hit. But Giseok's brain was human, and human brains were not like others, where alien neural architecture was efficient and specialized. Human neurons were chaotic and redundant and stubborn in ways that made no biological sense. The disruption tore through pathways that were already multiply connected, and instead of cascading failure, it met resistance. It was never designed to overcome. Giseok felt darkness pulling at him, felt his body trying to shut down, felt the cold embrace of death reaching for his chest. But somewhere in the chaos of his misfiring neurons, a voice that sounded like his mother reminded him that Koreans do not quit when things get hard. He forced his lungs to take a breath. He forced his heart to beat. He forced himself to stay alive through nothing but pure human stubbornness. The last thing he heard before unconsciousness claimed him was Queen Veleth screaming orders in a voice that shattered crystal. And the last thing he felt was her hands on his face, her alien touch surprisingly gentle against his burning skin. He wanted to tell her that he was fine, that he had survived worse during the Bizen earthquake of 2019. But the words would not come. Darkness swallowed him, but his heart kept beating somewhere in the Grand Crystalline Hall. The assassin was being seized by guards who had finally reacted to the chaos somewhere on the Velethri platform. Cathron's colors shifted to pale gray with shock as his carefully planned coup dissolved around him somewhere in the crowd. Ambassador Torvin watched a human servant take a killing blow for an alien queen and continue breathing despite every law of biology saying he should be dead. Interesting. The Dracorath growled to no one in particular. Very interesting indeed. Queen Veleth knelt beside the fallen human and held his hand while her physicians rushed to help. And her colors cycled through emotions that no Velethri had felt for a lesser species in all the long history of her people: gratitude, fear, and something else that had no name in her language. The human had saved her life, and now she watched him fight for his own with a determination that made her ancient heart ache in ways she did not understand. Live. she whispered in her own language. Not knowing if he could hear her, "Live, Kang Jisiak, and let me show you how a queen repays such a debt." In the medical chamber where they took him, machines hummed and clicked and struggled to understand a species they had never been designed to treat, but human bodies had evolved in the crucible of Earth's harsh environment, and human wills had been forged in 10,000 years of refusing to accept defeat. Jisiak's heart kept beating, his lungs kept breathing, and somewhere in the darkness of his unconscious mind, he dreamed of home and family and the simple purpose of helping those who needed him. The battle was not over, but he had survived the first blow. Now everything depended on what happened when he opened his eyes. Jisiok woke to the sound of arguments. His body felt like it had been taken apart and reassembled by someone who had never seen a human before, and every movement sent waves of pain through muscles that seemed to have forgotten how to work properly. But he was alive, and that was more than the neural disruptors designers had ever intended to allow. The medical chamber around him hummed with alien technology, and floating displays showed readouts he could not understand, but suspected were related to his vital signs. Through the transparent wall, he could see the corridor beyond, where Velithri guards stood at attention, and various officials hurried past with expressions of barely controlled panic. "He is awake," a voice announced, and Jisiok turned his head to find Princess Mirith sitting beside his bed, with colors that shifted between relief and lingering worry. "How long?" Jisiok managed to ask, and his voice came out as a rough whisper that hurt his throat. 2 days, Mirith replied. "And the physician said you should have died within seconds of being hit by that weapon." She leaned closer, her compound eyes studying him with wonder. "They have never seen anything like what your brain did," she continued. "And they say your neural pathways rebuilt themselves while you were unconscious, creating new connections to replace the ones the disruptor destroyed." Jisiok processed this information with the same calm he had applied to everything since his capture, though inside he felt a surge of grim satisfaction. Humans were survivors, and his species had not clawed its way to the top of Earth's food chain by giving up when things got difficult. "The summit?" he asked, and Mirith's colors shifted to something more complex. "The assassination attempt has thrown everything into chaos," she explained. "And Kethron is trying to use the situation to claim my sister is unfit to lead because she could not protect herself." Jisiok felt anger rise in his chest, a hot, fierce emotion that cut through the fog of his recovery. He had nearly died to save the queen, and now the man who had arranged her murder was using that very attack to advance his treachery. "Help me stand," he said, and Mirith's colors flared with alarm. "You cannot be serious," she protested. "And the physicians say you need at least another week of recovery." "The physicians do not know humans," Jisiok replied, and he began the painful process of pushing himself upright. His body screamed in protest, and his vision darkened at the edges. But he had worked through worse pain during his years in emergency medicine. He had once performed CPR for 45 minutes with a broken arm because there was no one else available, and he had walked 3 kilometers on a fractured ankle to reach a patient who needed him. This was just pain, and pain was temporary. Mirith supported him as he rose, and her surprised colors told him that she had not expected him to succeed. "The queen needs to know I am alive," Jisiok said, "and I have evidence that can end this conspiracy today." "What evidence?" Mirith Jisiok reached into the pocket of the medical gown someone had put on him and found what he was looking for, a small data chip that he had kept hidden since he began his investigation. "Everything," he said simply, "and we need to get to the council chamber before Kethron convinces anyone else that your sister should be removed." They moved through the palace corridors slowly, with Jisiok leaning heavily on Mirith's arm and ignoring the shocked looks from every being they passed. News of his survival had apparently not spread far, and the sight of the human queen's shadow walking upright after a killing below left aliens of a dozen species staring in disbelief. The council chamber doors loom before them, guarded by warriors who move to block their path. The human is supposed to be in medical care, one guard said firmly. The human is the queen's shadow. HFY replied with as much authority as he could muster through his exhaustion. And I will see my monarch now. Something in his voice, or perhaps in his eyes, made the guards hesitate. And in that moment of hesitation, Mirith pushed past them and threw open the doors. The chamber beyond was filled with delegates and advisors, all focused on a raised platform where Queen Valith stood facing High Advisor Kethronth. Old Velithri was speaking in tones of false concern about the Queen's judgment and the danger her leadership posed to the Dominion, and several delegates appeared to be nodding along with his words. Then HFY walked through the doors, and every voice in the chamber fell silent. Queen Valith's colors exploded into patterns of shock and joy that she could not have hidden even if she wanted to. And Kethron's face shifted to the pale gray of genuine terror. That is impossible, someone whispered in the crowd. Ambassador Torvin's rumbling laugh cut through the silence like a blade. I told you there was more to humans than meets the eye. The Dracorath said to no one in particular. Jysk walked forward through the parting crowd, each step costing him more effort than the last, until he stood before the assembled delegates. I am Kang HFY, he said, and his voice carried clearly through the chamber despite its roughness. And I am the Queen's shadow, and I have evidence that High Advisor Kethron has committed treason against the Dominion. He held up the data chip, and the floating displays throughout the chamber activated to show its contents recordings of secret meetings, financial transfers to known criminal organizations, and communications that laid bare every detail of the conspiracy. Kiran attempted to flee, but guards were already moving to block every exit. The old Velithri's colors cycled through rage and fear and finally settled on a defeated gray as restraints were placed on his forearms in the aftermath of the conspirators' arrest. Queen Valith descended from her platform and walked directly to HFY with a grace that made the distance seem both endless and instantaneous. You should be dead, she said softly. Her voice meant only for him. I have been told that several times in my life, HFY replied, and the ghost of a smile crossed his battered features. Valith reached out and touched his face with one of her 4 hands, and her colors shifted to something warm and wondering. I have lived for many centuries, she said, and I have seen warriors of every species perform great feats of strength and courage. She shook her head slowly, a human gesture she had perhaps learned from watching him. But I have never seen anyone do what you have done, and I do not understand how it is possible. HFY considered her question carefully before answering. Your Majesty, he said, humans do not have claws or psionics or armor, and we are not the strongest or the fastest or the smartest species in the galaxy. He paused and met her multifaceted eyes with his merely human ones. But when something matters to us, we do not stop, and when someone needs our protection, we will break ourselves against any obstacle to provide it. Queen Valith stared at him for a long moment, and in her ancient eyes, he saw something change, a shift in understanding that went deeper than words could express. I offered to purchase you from that auction as a curiosity, she said finally, and I thought I was acquiring a servant with unusual qualities. Her colors shifted to deep purple shot through with gold. Instead, I have gained something far more valuable, and I find myself in a debt I do not know how to repay. She stepped back and addressed the chamber in a voice that rang with royal authority. Let it be known throughout the Dominion and to all our allies and trading partners, she declared, that the human species has proven themselves worthy of respect, and that any who treat them as lesser beings will answer to me personally. the delegates murmured among themselves. And Jusiak saw the beginning of something that would reshape galactic politics for generations, not through war or conquest or threat of force, but through one human who had simply refused to stop when everything said he should later. After the summit concluded with treaties signed and alliances strengthened, Queen Valeth summoned Jusiak to her private chambers. "I am offering you your freedom," she said, "and I will provide transport back to Earth if that is what you wish." Jusiak looked through the window at the crystal spires and floating gardens of a world that had become unexpectedly familiar. He thought of Wanshik working peacefully in the kitchens, and Mirith waving from her balcony, and the queen who had believed a human servant when no one else would. "If it is acceptable to your majesty," he said slowly, "I think I would prefer to stay a while longer." Veleth's colors shifted to something that looked remarkably like happiness. "Then stay, Kang Jusiak," she said, and her voice carried warmth that he had not heard before. "And show them what humans truly are." Jusiak bowed his head in acceptance of a duty he had chosen rather than been forced into, and when he looked up again, he saw something in the queen's impossible eyes that looked very much like hope. The galaxy had learned a lesson about humanity today, and Jusiak suspected it was only the first of many. He smiled and prepared for whatever came next, because that was what humans did. They endured, they adapted, and they never stopped moving forward, not ever.